On the morning of July 2, 1943, over the dusty airstrip at Castelvetrano in western Sicily, the balance of expectation and reality shifted in an instant. A German Focke-Wulf FW-190 lifted into the Mediterranean sky, its pilot confident in both his aircraft and the racial certainties drilled into him by the Nazi state. He never noticed the American P-40L Warhawk descending rapidly from above. Seconds later, streams of .50 caliber fire ripped through the German fighter's airframe, and the aircraft fell away, twisting helplessly toward the fields below. At the controls of the American fighter was First Lieutenant Charles B. Hall, only 22 years old, raised in the small town of Brazil, Indiana. With that single engagement, Hall achieved something German commanders had long insisted could not happen. A black pilot had destroyed one of the Luftwaffe's premier combat aircraft in air-to-air combat. The victory was not merely tactical, it struck at the ideological core of the Third Reich. Nazi racial doctrine declared people of African descent to be undermentioned, inferior beings, supposedly lacking the intelligence, discipline, and bravery required for complex tasks like aerial warfare. Germany's Nuremberg laws had even outlawed marriages between Germans and people of African ancestry, reinforcing the myth of racial hierarchy as state policy. Yet above Sicily, that worldview met undeniable contradiction. The swastika insignia painted beneath Hall's cockpit that day marked the first confirmed aerial kill credited to a group of pilots who would go on to destroy 112 enemy aircraft during the war. These men, trained in Tuskegee, Alabama, would later become known to German pilots by a name whispered with equal parts confusion and fear: the Black Birdmen. What the Luftwaffe pilots did not realize as they climbed to intercept American bomber formations in 1943 was that they were engaging some of the most intensively prepared fighter aviators in the U.S. Army Air Forces. The Tuskegee pilots endured standards higher than those imposed on white units, survived constant scrutiny, and trained under the pressure of knowing that failure would be used to justify exclusion, not just for themselves, but for every black American who hoped to follow. Their combat record would soon speak with mathematical clarity. Over the course of the war, Tuskegee Airmen flew approximately 15,000 combat sorties across 1,578 missions. They achieved 112 confirmed aerial victories and, most notably, maintained a bomber escort loss rate that was significantly lower than many white fighter groups operating under similar conditions. These numbers were not propaganda, they were operational data. Figures that even the most committed Nazi racial theorists could not explain away. For the German High Command, these results posed an uncomfortable truth. The assumptions underpinning their ideology were collapsing in real time under the wings of American fighter escorts. Yet the story of that first kill over Sicily did not begin in Europe or North Africa. Its origins lay thousands of miles away in a deeply segregated United States. Long before they confronted enemy aircraft, the Tuskegee Airmen were forced to navigate institutional racism, political resistance, and widespread doubt about their very existence as military aviators. Their training program itself was controversial, created not out of belief in equality, but as a reluctant experiment. What followed was not just a combat legacy, but a transformation of military history. By consistently outperforming expectations and disproving both domestic prejudice and foreign propaganda, the Tuskegee pilots reshaped the understanding of who could fight, lead, and excel in modern warfare. In the skies over Europe and the Mediterranean, the equations of air combat were rewritten, not only in terms of tactics and losses, but in the collapse of a racial mythology that had claimed scientific certainty. Reality, delivered at high speed and high altitude, proved far more powerful. In the mid-1920s, the institutional racism embedded within the U.S. military was not hidden, it was formally documented. In 1925, the Army War College released an internal study titled Employment of Negro Manpower in War. The report openly asserted that African Americans were intellectually inferior to white soldiers and fundamentally deficient in character. According to this assessment, black servicemen were considered unsuitable for complex technical duties and allegedly lacked the moral strength required for leadership in combat. These conclusions were not fringe opinions, they reflected the official doctrine shaping military policy at the time. Yet, while senior officers relied on these deeply flawed assumptions, reality was already undermining them. Individual black Americans were quietly dismantling the myth of racial incapacity through undeniable achievement. During World War I, Eugene Bullard was forced to leave his own country to fulfill his dream of flight, earning his wings and flying combat missions for France because the United States refused to allow him into its air service. A few years later, in 1921, Bessie Coleman followed a similar path, traveling to France to obtain her pilot's license after every American aviation school turned her away due to both her race and her gender. By the early 1930s, organized proof of black aviation capability was impossible to ignore. The Coffey School of Aeronautics in Chicago had trained dozens of African-American civilian pilots, producing skilled aviators whose competence matched and often exceeded that of their white counterparts. These pilots demonstrated beyond doubt that mastery of flight depended on training and discipline, not skin color. As tensions escalated in Europe and the prospect of another global war loomed, pressure on the U.S. government intensified. Prominent civil rights advocates began to demand that the nation's military practices align with its democratic ideals. Walter White of the NAACP, labor leader A. Philip Randolph, and federal judge William H. Hastie relentlessly pushed for the inclusion of African Americans in military aviation. At the same time, influential black newspapers, including the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, and the Baltimore Afro-American, kept up a steady barrage of criticism. Their message was blunt and unavoidable. How could the United States claim to defend freedom overseas while enforcing exclusion and segregation at home? A small but significant breakthrough arrived on April 3, 1939. Public Law 18, amended by Senator Harry H. Swartz, required the civilian pilot training program to designate at least one flight school for the instruction of African American pilots. The policy did not dismantle segregation, it institutionalized it, but it nonetheless represented the first official acknowledgement that black Americans might belong in the cockpit. Political reality further accelerated change. As Franklin D. Roosevelt campaigned for an unprecedented third presidential term in 1940, African American voters in northern cities became increasingly important. Just weeks after his re-election effort gained momentum, the War Department made a historic announcement. On January 16, 1941, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson authorized the creation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, an all-black flying unit. The decision, however, came wrapped in skepticism. Military leaders openly described the unit as a trial, a controlled experiment to determine whether black men could be trained to serve as combat pilots. Command of this experiment fell to Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., a man uniquely shaped by both excellence and exclusion. The son of the first African-American general in U.S. Army history, Davis had graduated from West Point under extraordinary circumstances. For 4 years, his white classmates enforced a silent code, refusing to speak to him except when absolutely required. Now, as he prepared to lead his men into war, Davis understood that the burden they carried extended far beyond military success. Their performance would influence the fate of millions of black Americans who were watching closely. In April 1943, Davis led 26 pilots of the 99th Fighter Squadron to Tunisia, where they were stationed in Wadas. They were attached to the 33rd Fighter Group under Colonel William W. Mamier, an officer who openly doubted their ability. Mamier assigned the squadron to routine patrols over the Mediterranean, deliberately keeping them away from high-profile combat operations. His intent was transparent. He expected them to fail, and he was prepared to document that failure. Their first combat sortie came on June 2, 1943, during an assault on the heavily fortified Italian island of Pantelleria. Flying aging P-40 Warhawks, the Tuskegee pilots climbed toward their objective when German fighters suddenly entered the airspace. The squadron held formation and maintained bomber protection under pressure. No aircraft were lost, but the encounter sent a clear message. The pilots did not panic, scatter, or retreat. 1 month later, on July 2, 1943, that message became impossible to ignore. During an escort mission over Sicily, 2nd Lieutenant Charles Hall was flying his 8th combat sortie, guarding B-25 Mitchell bombers attacking the airfield at Castelvetrano. As 2 German Focke-Wulf 190 fighters closed in, Hall maneuvered aggressively between the attackers and the bombers. Turning tightly inside the enemy aircraft, he fired a sustained burst. One of the German fighters spiraled downward and slammed into the ground. When Hall returned to base, celebration erupted. For black mechanics and ground crew members, men who had endured constant humiliation from white personnel, the moment carried enormous weight. Hall's victory marked the first confirmed aerial kill by an African-American pilot in U.S. military history, shattering long-standing claims of black incompetence in air combat. Despite this achievement, resistance within the command structure persisted. By January 1944, after 7 months of combat operations, Colonel Mamier submitted a damaging report alleging that the 99th Fighter Squadron lacked initiative and aggressiveness. He recommended that the unit be removed from combat roles altogether. The report reached General Henry Hap Arnold, the commanding general of the U.S. Air Forces, who began considering whether the experiment should be terminated entirely. The fate of the Tuskegee Airmen and the broader question of racial equality in American military aviation now hung in the balance. The turning point came during the Allied landing at Anzio. In late January 1944, as Allied troops struggled to secure their foothold along the Italian coast, German air power struck back with intensity. On January 27th, the Luftwaffe launched sustained and aggressive air attacks against the crowded Allied positions around the Anzio beachhead. Facing these assaults were just 15 pilots from the 99th Fighter Squadron. They were flying Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, aircraft already considered outdated by this stage of the war. Against them were modern and highly capable Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters, widely regarded as superior in speed, firepower, and performance. What followed defied expectations. Over the course of 2 days of intense aerial combat, the pilots of the 99th Squadron successfully engaged the enemy and destroyed a significant number of German aircraft. Depending on the source, their confirmed victories ranged from 8 to as many as 13 enemy fighters shot down. Captain Charles Hall alone was credited with 2 additional kills, raising his personal total to 3 confirmed victories. Remarkably, in just 48 hours, the 99th achieved more aerial victories than they had accumulated during the previous 7 months of combat operations. This sudden and undeniable success forced the U.S. War Department to reevaluate long-standing assumptions. A formal study was ordered, comparing the performance of the 99th Fighter Squadron with other P-40 units in the theater. The findings were clear. The 99th was performing on par with white fighter squadrons operating under similar conditions. The battles over Anzio became a defining moment. They demonstrated beyond dispute that black pilots could perform with skill and effectiveness in frontline combat when given proper opportunities and support. By May 1944, a major organizational shift followed. The 332nd Fighter Group was officially formed by bringing together the 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons. Once marginalized, these units were now assigned a critical new mission. They were transferred to the 15th Air Force and tasked with long-range bomber escort duties, some of the most dangerous missions of the air war, deep into the heart of Nazi-controlled Europe. At Ramitelli Airfield, overlooking Italy's Adriatic coastline, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. addressed his pilots before they began this new phase of combat. His message was direct and uncompromising. The priority was not individual glory, not chasing enemy fighters, and not building personal victory scores. Their responsibility was simple and absolute: protect the bombers and ensure they return safely. This principle would become the foundation of their operational doctrine: stay with the bombers at all costs. In June 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces introduced a standardized visual identification system for fighter groups. Each unit received distinctive markings to allow instant recognition in the air. The 332nd Fighter Group was assigned the color red. Their aircraft were marked dramatically, entire tail sections painted a deep crimson, complemented by red nosebands and red propeller spinners. Flying P-51 Mustang fighters, the group quickly became impossible to miss. The bright red tails stood out against the sky, and soon bomber crews began to associate those markings with disciplined, close-flying escorts who refused to abandon their defensive positions. Many bomber crews were initially unaware that the pilots protecting them were black. What mattered was reputation. The word spread throughout the bomber formations: if possible, request the red tails. Their greatest challenge came on July 18, 1944. On that day, Colonel Davis personally led 66 P-51 Mustangs to rendezvous with bomber formations assigned to attack the Luftwaffe air base at Memmingen, Germany. The operation quickly became complicated when the bombers failed to arrive on schedule. Rather than withdrawing, Davis made a critical and risky decision. He ordered his fighters to remain circling deep inside hostile airspace, conserving fuel while waiting for the bombers. When the bomber stream finally appeared, they were immediately followed by the enemy. Nearly 100 German fighters attacked from multiple directions, attempting to overwhelm the escort screen. The Luftwaffe had adapted its tactics, believing that sheer numbers might finally shatter the Red Tails' disciplined formation. The resulting battle was brutal and chaotic. The 332nd claimed between 11 and 12 enemy aircraft destroyed, but the cost was high. In roughly 20 minutes of relentless fighting, 15 B-17 bombers were shot down by German fighters. The 332nd Fighter Group lost 3 pilots that day: Lieutenants Robert H. Hutton, Wellington J. Irving, and Alfred R. Brown. In the aftermath, critics seized on the bomber losses as evidence that black pilots were incapable of handling large-scale air battles. However, a detailed operational review told a different story. The Red Tails had arrived to find the bombers already under massive, coordinated attack by superior enemy forces. Their actions had prevented what could have been a far greater catastrophe. Rather than failing, they had stabilized a nearly impossible situation. By early 1945, the balance of air power had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. The Luftwaffe's conventional fighter force was a shadow of its former strength, struggling to contest Allied control of the skies. Yet Germany still possessed one final technological advantage. Entering combat was the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet-powered fighter. Capable of speeds approaching 540 miles per hour, it could outrun every propeller-driven aircraft in the Allied arsenal. Though too late and too few to change the outcome of the war, the Me-262 marked the dawn of a new era in aerial warfare and represented the final challenge faced by pilots who had already rewritten history through discipline, perseverance, and quiet excellence. On March 24, 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group was assigned one of the most demanding missions of the European Air War. Their task was to escort Allied bombers on an exceptionally long operation, nearly 1,600 miles round trip, deep into the German heartland, with Berlin as the destination. The target was a major armored vehicle production facility belonging to Daimler-Benz, a site considered vital to Germany's war effort. Allied intelligence warned that the mission would face a serious threat. Germany's revolutionary jet fighters, the Messerschmitt Me-262s, were expected to be launched by Jagdgeschwader 7, the Luftwaffe's elite jet unit. These aircraft were faster than anything the Allies could field, and their presence raised the stakes considerably. Leading the escort was Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who commanded a force of 43 P-51 Mustangs, sleek, long-range fighters flown by the Tuskegee Airmen. As the formation approached Berlin, the warning proved accurate. Dozens of Me-262s appeared, forming what would become the largest concentration of German jet fighters ever deployed for a single interception. Among the American pilots was Lieutenant Roscoe Brown, who had carefully studied the jet's limitations. Although the Me-262 had overwhelming speed, it suffered from poor visibility and sluggish handling during turns. Rather than attempting a direct pursuit, Brown and others used a counterintuitive tactic. They deliberately moved away from the jets, then maneuvered back into positions where the German pilots could not see them. Brown later described the engagement in precise terms. Climbing at a shallow angle, he opened fire from behind and below, delivering several sustained bursts. Almost immediately, the German pilot ejected at high altitude, abandoning the jet. It was one of the rare instances where a propeller-driven fighter successfully downed a jet in aerial combat. Another extraordinary moment followed when Lieutenant Earl Lane achieved what many believed was nearly impossible. Using the newly introduced K-14 computing gun sight, Lane scored a kill on an Me-262 with a deflection shot from roughly 2,000 yards, an exceptional demonstration of both technology and pilot skill. Lieutenant Charles Brantley added a third jet victory to the group's tally that day. In a single engagement, the 332nd Fighter Group destroyed more Me-262s than many Allied units managed throughout the entire war. By the end of that afternoon, the Red Tails had surpassed the total number of jet kills previously credited to all American forces combined. The mission earned the 332nd a Distinguished Unit Citation, a formal recognition of extraordinary heroism under extreme conditions. Yet not every encounter between the Tuskegee Airmen and the enemy ended with success. Over the course of the war, 32 pilots from the group were captured and held as prisoners of war, and their experiences revealed striking contradictions within the German military system. One such pilot was Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson, who was shot down on August 12, 1944, during his 19th combat mission. While flying a ground attack operation over southern France, his P-51 was struck by anti-aircraft fire as he strafed enemy radar sites. Forced to bail out, Jefferson was soon captured. During interrogation, he was stunned by the depth of German intelligence. His interrogator possessed detailed knowledge not only of the 332nd Fighter Group's operations and leadership, but also of Jefferson's personal life. The officer knew the location of Ramitelli Airfield, the identities of squadron commanders, and even information about Jefferson's parents in Detroit, including his father's profession and his mother's maiden name. The thoroughness of the intelligence effort left a lasting impression. Jefferson was eventually transferred to Stalag Luft III, a prisoner of war camp for Allied airmen. There, he found himself treated no differently than other American officers. White bomber pilots frequently approached him to express appreciation for the protection they had received from the Red Tail escorts. These moments of mutual respect occurred naturally inside the camp, an environment where, ironically, racial segregation coded within German ideology did not govern daily interactions among prisoners. The contradiction was not lost on Jefferson. He later reflected on the bitter irony of experiencing greater equality among fellow Americans while imprisoned in a Nazi camp than he often encountered in his own country. When the war ended and Jefferson returned home, the contrast became painfully clear. Upon arrival in the United States, he was immediately subjected to racial segregation at the disembarkation point, despite having fought and survived combat in Europe. German pilots, for their part, reportedly recognized the effectiveness of the 332nd, referring to them with a nickname that translated loosely as Black Bird Men. Yet it was the bomber crews who became the group's most vocal supporters. For men who faced death on every mission, survival mattered far more than race. Over time, bomber crews developed a collective legend around the Red Tails. They spoke of the pilots' disciplined formations, their distinctive red-painted tails, and their habit of gently rocking their wings in greeting. Most importantly, stories spread about their unwavering commitment to stay with damaged bombers rather than chasing enemy fighters for personal victories. To many bomber crews, they became known simply as the Red Tail Angels. Statistical analysis later supported these perceptions. Research conducted by Air Force historian Dr. Daniel Hallman showed that bombers escorted by the 332nd Fighter Group lost significantly fewer aircraft to enemy fighters than those protected by other P-51 units in the 15th Air Force. 27 losses compared to an average of 46. This exceptional record was achieved despite the Red Tails routinely flying some of the longest and most hazardous missions of the air war. By the time the conflict ended, the combat performance of the Tuskegee Airmen had decisively shattered the assumptions that existed before the war. Their record not only demonstrated professional excellence under fire, but also permanently challenged the myths that had once been used to justify their exclusion from military aviation. By the end of World War II, the operational record of the Tuskegee Airmen stood as one of the most extensive and closely examined combat performances of any American fighter unit. Over the course of the war, they participated in 1,578 combat operations, flying well beyond 15,000 individual sorties. Among these were 179 long-range bomber escort missions, a role demanding exceptional discipline and coordination, and 311 additional missions carried out in direct support of the 15th Air Force. Their effectiveness against enemy aviation was unmistakable. In aerial engagements, Tuskegee pilots were credited with 112 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, while another 150 aircraft were eliminated on the ground during strafing and attack runs. On March 24, 1945, the group achieved one of its most remarkable feats by shooting down 3 German Me-262 jet fighters, aircraft that represented the cutting edge of Luftwaffe technology. Beyond air-to-air combat, the unit inflicted significant damage on Axis infrastructure. Their attacks destroyed approximately 950 rail cars, trucks, and other motor vehicles, along with 254 locomotive engines, severely disrupting enemy logistics. Naval targets were not spared. On June 25, 1944, a former Italian destroyer, Giuseppe Missori, was struck and damaged so extensively that it was rendered permanently unusable. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Red Tails lay in their escort record. Across nearly 180 bomber protection missions, only 27 escorted bombers were lost to enemy fighters, a figure dramatically lower than the average loss rate of 46 bombers experienced by comparable units. This consistent level of protection established the Tuskegee Airmen as one of the most reliable escort groups in the European theater. Individual pilots also distinguished themselves repeatedly. Lee Archer, Joseph Ellsbury, and Edward Toppins each achieved 4 confirmed aerial victories. Ellsbury's record included 3 Focke-Wulf fighters destroyed in a single day, July 12, 1944. Another pilot, Clarence Lucky, Lester, downed 3 enemy aircraft in one mission on July 18, 1944, a rare accomplishment in any Air Force. Recognition followed these achievements. pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 744 Air Medals, 14 Bronze Stars, and 8 Purple Hearts. The 99th Fighter Squadron received 3 Distinguished Unit Citations, while the 332nd Fighter Group as a whole was awarded 1 additional unit citation, underscoring its sustained combat excellence. The cost of this record, however, was substantial. 66 pilots were killed in action, 32 were captured and held as prisoners of war, and 84 airmen lost their lives in training accidents or non-combat missions. These losses reflected the inherent dangers of wartime aviation rather than any lack of skill or preparation. The transformation of the Tuskegee Airmen's reputation from skepticism and ridicule to widespread respect was not driven by bravery alone. It was the product of rigorous American training systems combined with the disciplined use of increasingly advanced aircraft. At Tuskegee Army Airfield, cadets logged approximately 300 flight hours, far exceeding the 200-hour average of white pilot trainees elsewhere. Formation flying was drilled relentlessly, based on the belief that precision and teamwork would determine survival in combat. This intensity produced a harsh selection process. The washout rate at Tuskegee reached 60%, compared to roughly 40% among white cadets. Only the most capable candidates completed the program, leading Colonel Noel Parrish, the base commander, to describe the graduates as a super-selected group. The evolution of their aircraft mirrored their journey. The 99th Fighter Squadron initially flew Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, aircraft that were already outdated by the time the unit reached North Africa. Powered by liquid-cooled Allison engines, the P-40s lagged behind German Bf-109s and FW-190s in speed, climb rate, and altitude performance. Yet the Tuskegee pilots exploited the Warhawks' tight turning radius and exceptional durability, allowing them to survive and fight effectively despite technical disadvantages. Everything changed in July 1944 with the arrival of the North American P-51 Mustang. Equipped with a Packard-built Merlin engine, the P-51D combined speed, firepower, and endurance at a level unmatched by most wartime fighters. Capable of reaching 437 miles per hour, armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns and boasting a combat range of over 1,600 miles with drop tanks, the Mustang enabled the Red Tails to escort bombers deep into the heart of the German Reich. Yet combat success was never the work of pilots alone. Behind each aerial victory stood dozens of ground crew members, mechanics, armorers, crew chiefs, and support staff who ensured aircraft were fueled, repaired, armed, and ready to fly. Of the roughly 16,000 Tuskegee Airmen who served during the war, fewer than 1,000 were pilots. The remainder formed the essential backbone of the operation, often overlooked but indispensable to every mission flown. Together, their combined effort reshaped both military history and the future of the United States Armed Forces. Despite operating under severe limitations, the ground crews assigned to the 332nd Fighter Group achieved results that bordered on the extraordinary. Ramitelli Airfield in southern Italy lacked the infrastructure found at most American installations. Facilities were crude, equipment was outdated, and replacement parts were often unavailable. When supplies did arrive, the 332nd was frequently the last unit to receive them. Yet even under these conditions, the percentage of aircraft deemed mission-ready consistently matched or surpassed that of better-funded all-white units. These mechanics and technicians were not merely support personnel. They faced the dangers of war firsthand. Enemy attacks on Ramitelli were infrequent, but when they occurred, the consequences were devastating. On March 24, 1944, a German bombing raid struck the airfield, killing several members of the support staff. Rather than retreat, the surviving crew members continued their work amid explosions and fire, moving aircraft away from ignited fuel storage areas and preventing further destruction. Their actions saved lives and preserved valuable combat resources. The air war over Europe represented the ultimate proving ground for the Tuskegee Airmen. Strategic bombing was central to the Allied war effort, and each B-17 flying fortress symbolized a massive investment. At a cost of nearly $250,000 per aircraft and carrying 10 highly trained crew members, the loss of even one bomber had consequences that extended far beyond a single mission. Every downed aircraft weakened operational momentum and morale. For this reason, protecting bombers was considered far more critical than individual aerial victories. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., commander of the 332nd, understood this reality with absolute clarity. He instructed his pilots to ignore the temptation to pursue enemy fighters that attempted to lure escorts away from the bombers. Shooting down an enemy aircraft, he warned, meant little if it left bombers exposed. True discipline, he believed, was demonstrated by staying in formation and maintaining protection even when enemy pilots retreated. Over time, the Red Tails refined their escort strategy into a highly effective defensive system. Their approach relied on 3 coordinated layers. One group flew in close formation directly above the bombers, another positioned itself at medium range to intercept approaching enemy fighters, and a third operated at higher altitude to counter diving attacks. This structure demanded constant communication, precise timing, and unwavering adherence to orders. The effectiveness of the system was built on collective discipline rather than individual glory. While flying combat missions overseas, the Tuskegee Airmen were engaged in another struggle at home. They fought fascist ideology abroad while confronting racial discrimination within their own country. Their performance in combat directly contradicted both Nazi racial doctrines and long-standing American segregationist beliefs. In the skies over Europe, skill and professionalism proved independent of race. Yet recognition of their achievements was uneven. African-American newspapers prominently reported their victories, while mainstream media outlets often downplayed or ignored them entirely. The Pittsburgh Courier's Double V campaign, calling for victory against tyranny overseas and injustice at home, frequently highlighted the Tuskegee Airmen as living proof of Black excellence and patriotism. Ironically, enemy forces were often more aware of their identity than the American public. By the final year of the war, German pilots reportedly knew exactly who flew the distinctive red-tailed Mustangs and referred to them with a name that explicitly acknowledged their race. Meanwhile, many white Americans remained unaware that Black fighter pilots even existed. This absence of public knowledge was not accidental. The War Department made little effort to promote their successes. When the war in Europe ended, celebration did not immediately follow for the men of the 332nd. While white units prepared for parades and public acclaim, Tuskegee Airmen faced uncertainty about their future. Despite overwhelming combat evidence disproving segregationist assumptions, military leadership initially planned to preserve racial separation within the armed forces. For decades after World War II, the accomplishments of the Tuskegee Airmen remained largely absent from the national narrative. Many veterans carried their stories in silence. Lee Archer, credited with 4 aerial victories, went on to a successful civilian career but rarely mentioned his wartime service. He later explained that few people believed him. The idea of a Black fighter ace, he said, was dismissed as implausible. Change came slowly, but it came. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, mandating the desegregation of the United States military. The combat record of the Tuskegee Airmen played a significant role in shaping that decision. Their legacy stands not only as a testament to courage and discipline in war, but as a force that helped reshape American institutions and challenge deeply rooted injustice. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the commander who led the famed Red Tails in combat missions over Berlin, would later make history himself. In 1954, he broke a barrier that had long stood unchallenged, becoming the first African-American general in the United States Air Force. Yet this milestone did not signal immediate recognition for the men he led. For decades, their accomplishments remained largely overlooked, buried beneath institutional silence and social prejudice. It was not until 2007 that the nation formally acknowledged their service at the highest level. That year, President George W. Bush presented the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen. By then, time had taken its toll. Out of the hundreds of pilots who once trained and fought together, only about 300 were still alive to witness the moment. Many of them had endured more than 6 decades of waiting for their country to publicly affirm what history had already proven. The shift from ridicule to respect was not a matter of legend or exaggeration. It was supported by records, mission reports, and combat statistics that left no room for debate. The evidence was precise and uncompromising. Pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group were credited with 112 confirmed aerial victories against the German Luftwaffe. In a single operation, they succeeded in destroying 3 Me-262 jet fighters, among the most advanced aircraft of the war. On the ground, they eliminated roughly 150 enemy planes before they could ever take off. Perhaps most striking was their bomber escort record. While other escort groups typically lost an average of 46 bombers, the Red Tails lost only 27 under comparable conditions. Their discipline, formation flying, and refusal to abandon protected aircraft directly challenged the false assumptions that had surrounded them. Their excellence was further reflected in the 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses awarded to pilots of the 332nd, honors earned not through symbolism, but through sustained performance under fire. German pilots reportedly gave them a name, Schwarze Vögel, or Blackbirds, a label that carried reluctant respect from an enemy forced to recognize skill where ideology said it should not exist. Each enemy aircraft destroyed, every bomber safely guided home, and every completed mission added another layer to an undeniable truth. Combat effectiveness has no connection to skin color. One of those pilots, Roscoe Brown Jr., who famously shot down a German jet during an engagement over Berlin, later reflected on the broader meaning of their service. He explained that their struggle went far beyond the battlefield. They were fighting not only a foreign enemy, but also entrenched ignorance, racial bias, and systemic exclusion. In his words, those battles were won as decisively as any dogfight. The Tuskegee Airmen did more than secure military victories. Their legacy reshaped the course of American history. They confronted the Luftwaffe in the skies, undermined Nazi racial doctrines through undeniable competence, and, over time, helped dismantle segregation within the U.S. Armed Forces by proving that discrimination collapsed when faced with excellence. When finally given the opportunity to serve without restraint, the Tuskegee Airmen rose above expectations imposed on them by others. Mockery gave way to admiration, prejudice was replaced by acceptance, and former enemies became unwilling witnesses to their achievements. Their story stands not as a myth, but as a documented chapter of history, one in which courage, discipline, and skill rewrote the boundaries of what was considered possible.